Hey, and welcome to this video. So we're going to be focusing here around giving an overview around what a domain is and what is Active Directory. Now, you've probably heard these terms. What is a domain? What is AD? AD is Active Directory, if you've ever heard of AD. And essentially this is, AD specifically is a Microsoft technology. So Microsoft have developed this and it's in use across a lot of different organizations. AD is sort of the, the foundation that a lot of companies will use when it comes to administering a lot of the networks and a lot of the security around networks. Now, there are others out there that are sort of competing against Active Directory specifically, but AD really is the clear winner, the clear market leader. So knowing Active Directory is almost like foundational if you want to work in IT, if you want to improve in your skills in IT. So AD is essentially a centralized hierarchy, repository of user objects, of all sort of objects around users, computers, security groups that essentially are used for your network to be able to authenticate against a domain. So it's almost like a gatekeeper to be able to allow a user, for example, that logs into a computer, it authenticates against a domain, an Active Directory, and then grants that user access permissions to a specific thing on the network. So all of these objects, user objects, computer objects, server objects, all of this stuff that is in Active Directory is actually stored within a domain that sits within Active Directory. So the domain is the central container, the central database where objects authenticate against, and all of that process essentially is managed within Active Directory. So to actually go and configure a domain and a Active Directory environment, it needs to be set up within a domain controller. Right? So you may have heard the term domain controller. So you'll have yourself a Windows server, right? For example, Windows Server 2019. You then convert that Windows server into a domain controller, and by converting it to a domain controller, you then install a whole bunch of AD tools, Active Directory tools, which then make your domain controller essentially an AD server, an Active Directory server with a relevant domain. When you're configuring your domain controller, you allocate a domain to it. So you give it a specific name. So domain is essentially just a database. You're going to give it a name. So for example, myhome.com. That becomes your domain. Think about, for example, on the web. Right, you've got an internet browser and you go to google.com. Well, google.com is a domain that is obviously publicly available out on the internet. Your domain is almost like a private network domain name that you give within your organization. It can be public as well, but generally your domain within an Active Directory environment is for you internally. And all of your objects on your network, or your relevant objects on your network, will all talk and communicate with your domain and managed all within Active Directory. When you are configuring a domain controller, you've also got what's called a forest. So you've got a forest and a domain. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but essentially a forest is the top level, and then the domain is what sits within the forest. So you could have multiple domains within a central forest. Now, why would you want to do this? Now, if you're in a smaller organization, perhaps a forest with a specific name, so you can still call it mycompany.com as the forest name, and then the domain inside of it could be mycompany.com, and that's really just the domain sitting within a forest. If you're in a larger organization, so let's say you've got hundreds or thousands and thousands of staff, you may want to have different domains or multiple domains all sitting within a centralized forest. So your forest is almost like your top level, and then you may have, let's say you've got a forest called mycompany.com, and within that company, there are actually 3 sub-companies. So let's say in the real world, you've got a company called, Google.com, and within Google, there's actually a lot of sub-Google companies, right? There's not just Google.com is just the parent company. Well, there's a parent company above them, but there's also little sub-companies, right? So this is something that you have to think about when you're configuring your network, because you could have mycompany.com, mycompanyb.com, mycompanyc.com, different staff, different levels of permissions, different computers, and they can't really talk to each other. We really don't want them to talk to each other, but they all sit within the parent company, which is your forest. So that's sort of a little bit around the overviews. You can set up what's called domain trusts between the domains, so you can share resources between all of this sort of stuff, but we're getting very, very advanced and you're probably already lost with what we're talking about. So forest top level, domain underneath it, and you can have multiple domains within a single forest. Now, what helps me is obviously to look at a visual diagram of what this looks like. So you can see right here what we're talking about. We should really show you a bit of an overview around the domain controller, and then you've got your Active Directory, your domain, as well as your forest, and all of your Active Directory domains sitting within it. So that's really how it works from a nutshell. It's very, very great, and it's foundational for you to know. So there you have it. That is just a very, very brief overview. There are other videos that will talk about a little bit more detail around this specifically, but there you go. That's a domain controller, a domain, an Active Directory.